When I first went to Beijing, in fact just before that, I'd studied 5 years of Chinese at the Australian National University. And then joined the Australian Foreign Service. Seemed like a reasonable thing to do. And the Australian Foreign Service, one of the most professional foreign services in the world, then elected to send me to Sweden as a fluent speaker of Chinese. Any of you been to Stockholm recently? It still doesn't have a decent Chinese restaurant. But having spent 2 years in Sweden, I was then posted back to Beijing, having lost a fair slab of my Chinese in the meantime. But that's the eternal wisdom of foreign services around the world. But when I was taught Chinese at the Australian National University, we had this great array of teachers who came originally from Beijing. And their pronunciation was classic Beijing dialect. It was, for those of you who don't know Chinese, it's BBC Chinese. And so it's RP, it's received pronunciation. And so, which is good, but bad. Good in the sense that you emerge speaking reasonable Mandarin. You get your tones right and all that sort of stuff. You are sentenced for hours in the language laboratory. Bad in the sense that when you start speaking to real live Chinese, you sound a bit like an English establishment git within the Chinese language. It's a bit like rolling into a conversation and your average Chinese hears the foreigner saying, "I say, Jumbo, what a wonderful day. When did we pop down to the club for a spot of polo?" That version of Chinese. Anyway, our ambassador in Beijing had the idea that the smart thing to do was to use me as his official interpreter. Those of you who speak Chinese here who are foreigners, and there's quite a gathering here tonight, will know that there is a world of difference between being able to speak Chinese on the one hand and being able to act as someone's interpreter on the other. If you speak Chinese, that's terrific. Guess what? Because you can decide what you say and what you don't say. In other words, you never reach beyond your abilities. If you're interpreting for some other guy, then frankly, you don't control what the other guy says. So despite my remonstrances at the time, he insisted that I travel to the Great Hall of the People with him for his first official gathering with the then Chinese Minister for Agriculture. And it was a nerve-wracking experience. So you arrive in the Great Hall of the People. Many of you would have been there before. You go into one of those ginormous rooms which are purposely designed, as our Chinese friends will tell us, to intimidate foreign barbarians, because they are at least 5 times as tall as this room, and that's just for a private meeting. And then the protocol, of course, is you all sit in a horseshoe. You've seen the classical Chinese horseshoe. Chief Chinese Poobah sits there, Deputy Chief Chinese Poobah, Assistant Chief Chinese Poobah, right down the food chain until you get to the array of junior woodchucks at the other end. And foreign barbarians similarly aligned. Chief Foreign Barbarian, Deputy Chief Foreign Barbarian, other assorted big noses down the other side. And so I'm speaking the truth, I can tell by our Chinese friends laughing. But the really unique spot to sit is if you happen to have lassoed into being the person who is interpreting for the evening, because you get the 2 jump seats behind the seats of the 2 principals. And so there you walk into the Great Hall of the People, Australian delegation, me with Ambassador, I'm First Secretary of the Embassy, and I get ushered to the interpreter's seat, and I'm sitting across from the professionally trained for 10 years bilingual interpreter from the Chinese side. He looks at me, I look at him, he spots the perspiration on my brow, he knows he's winning, and we haven't even started yet. Anyway, our ambassador began his engagement with the Chinese agriculture minister, who was He Kang in those days, with a very simple phrase, but I thought it was a trifle inelegant. He said, Australia and China are enjoying a relationship of unprecedented closeness. I thought that's very clumsy. That's just not elegant English. A note to file, whenever anyone you're interpreting for doesn't say it right, resist the great temptation to improve what said person has said. But of course, in those days, I had no such wisdom. And so I then rendered that phrase into Chinese, but I thought it needed a classical flourish, a little bit of classical Chinese, a little bit of Wenyan on the way through, just to get the thing off onto a good and elegant and prosaic start, a classical start. Of course, it didn't quite work that way. So I rendered that into Chinese, and it was very interesting to observe the Chinese reactions down one side of the room. The chief Chinese Poobah, deputy chief Chinese Poobahs, basically you could see a physical draining of blood from the face, and then looks of blank stares at the middle range of the Chinese official side of the horseshoe, down to peals of unrestrained laughter from the junior members of the Chinese horseshoe. Of course, most Australians were just bemused by what was going on, including our ambassador. Apparently what I had said in translating his phrase, Australia and China are enjoying a relationship of unprecedented closeness, was that Australia and China are enjoying fantastic, mutually satisfying orgasm. And so that was the last time I was asked to interpret. So